The knock came at 7:42 on a Tuesday morning, the kind of hour when Daniel Ashford was still standing barefoot in his kitchen, coffee in one hand and a half-eaten piece of toast in the other. He almost didn't answer. He almost let it ring out the way he let most things ring out that year: bills, phone calls from his sister, invitations he no longer had the energy to accept. But the knock came again, softer this time, almost apologetic. Standing on his porch was Eleanor Voss, 68 years old, silver hair pinned back with the same tortoiseshell clip she wore every day, a cardigan buttoned wrong by one hole. She had lived next door for as long as Daniel could remember, a woman who watered her roses at exactly 6 every evening and never once, in 3 years, had asked him for anything. "I need a favor," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. "And I need you not to ask me why." "Not yet." Daniel blinked. "Okay. I need you to pretend to be my husband." For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Somewhere down the street a dog barked twice and went quiet. "Eleanor," Daniel said carefully, "your husband passed away. Didn't he? You told me, years ago, I think." Something flickered behind her eyes, there and gone, like a light switched off before he could see the room it lit. "Yes," she said. "He did. That's not who I need you to be. If a story like this makes you believe that the quietest people are often carrying the heaviest things, stay with us. Like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness rarely announces itself, and subscribe to Midnight Tales for more." Daniel hadn't always been a man who answered doors slowly. 2 years earlier, he'd been an engineer with a fiancée, a mortgage he could actually afford, and a laugh people said they could hear from 2 rooms away. Then came the diagnosis, not his, hers, and the 11 months that followed, and the quiet apartment he now lived in that still had her toothbrush in a drawer he couldn't bring himself to empty. He hadn't told Eleanor any of that. He hadn't told anyone the full shape of it. But grief has a smell, in a way, and people who carry their own tend to recognize it on others without needing the details. Eleanor sat at his kitchen table now, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking. "My son is coming this weekend," she said. "David. He lives in Denver. He calls twice a year, if I'm lucky, and every time he does, he asks the same question: 'Mom, are you managing alone? Do you need someone there with you? And you want him to think you're not alone?' I want him to stop asking." Her jaw tightened. "He's been talking about a facility. Assisted living. He thinks I can't take care of myself, that I'm confused, that I forget things. I forgot one appointment, Daniel. One. And now he calls a lawyer instead of calling me." Daniel turned his coffee cup in slow circles on the table, not meeting her eyes. "So the plan is I show up this weekend and pretend to be, what, exactly? Your husband?" Wouldn't he recognize a con from a mile away? "He hasn't visited in 4 years, Eleanor said quietly. He wouldn't know his own mother's handwriting anymore, let alone the man standing in her kitchen." There was something underneath the request that Daniel couldn't yet name, not quite desperation, not quite fear, but close cousins to both. He agreed before he understood why he was agreeing, except that some part of him recognized a person doing whatever it took not to be pitted, and he knew that feeling from the inside out. The next few days, something unexpected happened. What began as rehearsal, Eleanor coaching Daniel on how her late husband, Walter, used to hold his fork, how he cleared his throat before disagreeing with anyone, became something else entirely. Conversation. Actual conversation, the kind Daniel hadn't had with another human being in longer than he wanted to admit. He learned that Eleanor had been a nurse for 31 years. That she had delivered more babies in emergency rooms than most doctors ever would. That Walter had proposed to her in a hospital cafeteria because he couldn't wait until her shift ended. She learned that Daniel had once been engaged. She didn't push when he stopped mid-sentence. She simply refilled his tea and let the silence do the work silence is good at. "You don't talk about her," Eleanor observed one evening, not as an accusation, just a fact laid gently on the table between them. "Neither do you." "About Walter?" "Not really." Eleanor's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "Touché. Why me?" Daniel finally asked. "You could have asked anyone on this street. Why the guy who barely leaves his house?" Eleanor considered this for a long moment. Because you're the only person on this street who looks at me like I'm still a person and not a problem to be managed. She paused. David used to look at me that way too. Before. Saturday arrived gray and cool. David Voss stepped out of a rental car in a coat too expensive for his mother's modest street, phone already halfway to his ear before he'd finished shutting the door. He was 41, tired around the eyes in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, the particular exhaustion of a man convinced he was the only responsible adult in every room he entered. He stopped short at the sight of Daniel standing in the doorway beside his mother. Mom. His eyes moved between them, calculating. Who is this? David, Eleanor said, steady as ever, this is. I know who you told me he is, David interrupted, and something in his voice cracked open, raw and unrehearsed. I need you to tell me the truth. Please. The porch went silent. Daniel felt Eleanor's hand tighten almost imperceptibly against his arm, not for the performance. For real. The truth, Eleanor said slowly, is that I was afraid of what would happen if you thought I was alone. David's jaw worked. He looked, for a moment, less like an executive and more like a boy who had once been afraid of the dark and had never quite said so out loud. Alone. He said. Mom, I've been terrified for a year. You forgot Dad's birthday last spring. You called me by his name in March. I didn't bring up assisted living because I think you're weak. I brought it up because I don't know how to help you and I live 2,000 miles away and every time I call, you tell me you're fine, and I don't believe you, and I don't know what to do with that. Eleanor's composure, held together for days by sheer will, finally gave way. Her eyes filled. I didn't want to be something you had to manage, she whispered. I wanted to still be your mother. Not a case file. What David didn't know, what none of them fully understood until that afternoon unraveled on the porch, was that Eleanor's memory lapses weren't confusion at all. They were grief, tangled and unprocessed, the kind that makes a woman say her dead husband's name to her living son because some nights the line between then and now simply refuses to hold. She hadn't told David the full truth about how hard the anniversary of Walter's death had hit her that March. She hadn't told him about the nights she sat in Walter's old chair, talking to no one, because the house was too quiet to bear otherwise. She had been so afraid of being seen as fragile that she had hidden the very grief that made her human. And Daniel, the stranger playing husband for an afternoon, was the only person who had actually asked her, gently, without an agenda, what she was afraid of. David sat down on the porch steps, all the armor gone out of him at once. I don't want to put you anywhere, Mom. I just don't want to lose you the way we lost Dad. Slowly. Without either of us saying anything true to each other. Eleanor sat beside her son for the first time in years without a phone or a schedule between them. Then let's start saying true things, she said. Starting now. Daniel stood to leave, feeling suddenly like an intruder in a moment that belonged only to the two of them. Eleanor caught his sleeve before he could step away. Stay, she said. Not as Walter. Just as yourself. I think David should know the man who's been checking on his mother twice a day isn't a stranger. He's a friend. For the first time since his own fiancée's funeral, Daniel felt something in his chest loosen, not fixed, not healed, but no longer entirely alone in its weight. Months later, David called every Sunday, no lawyer, no agenda, just his mother's voice on the other end of the line. Eleanor still watered her roses at 6 every evening, but now Daniel often stood beside her, watering can in hand, saying nothing in particular, which had somehow become its own kind of conversation. He never did pretend to be Walter again. He didn't need to. Eleanor had never actually needed a husband standing in her kitchen. She had needed one honest witness to the fact that she was still afraid of being forgotten, by her son, by the world, by the version of herself that used to save lives instead of quietly trying to hold on to her own. And Daniel, who had spent 2 years believing grief meant disappearing quietly from his own life, learned something from an almost stranger on his porch, that the bravest thing two wounded people can do for each other isn't fixing what's broken. It's simply staying long enough to see it. If this story reminded you that the people who seem the strongest are often the ones most afraid to ask for help, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and remember to check in on your quietest neighbor. Sometimes the knock on the door isn't really about the favor being asked. It's about being seen.